Welcome to Sage and Fettle Ayurveda. I'm Angelina Fox, and today we're going to be talking about baking our pumpkin or our squash, whatever it is that we are choosing to bake. So once you've cut it in half, seeded it, you might have a little stump still stuck on there. So I'm just going to cut that off. I'm going to turn the pumpkin on its top part there where the stem was. I'm just going to try to cut that off with a knife. So again, just have to use a little elbow grease and then you can pop it off there. So the reason we want to do this is so that we can allow it to be as flat as possible. You might have a stubborn stump, so I'm going to try to just get mine off, so you'll want to be really careful with this. So you always want to make sure your gripping fingers are tucked in and just give it a little bit of a chop and then cut it out. All right, so like chopping wood. All right, so once you've got that, you know it'll be flat. You can put your knife off to the side, and you'll want to coat the inside, so the fleshy side of your squash, with some sort of oil. So it could be butter, it could be vegetable oil, whatever it is that you like. So I'm going to use some ghee today. Before you coat it, you'll want to make sure that you have your oven preheated to 400 degrees, and then you'll scoop a little bit of your oil out, whatever it is that you're using. So mine's a little bit solidified. It's cooling off here now that it's starting to become fall. So you'll want to scoop it in, and you want to make sure you have enough to coat the whole fleshy part. Okay. And it gets a little messy. You can use your spoon if you like. I like to use my fingers, but I just start to kind of coat the, especially if it's a little bit solidified, this is a little bit easier, but you just kind of coat the whole fleshy part and then also into the scooped out part. So you want to just kind of move it around a bit, try to cover as much as you can. And it's okay if if you're using ghee and it's a little solidified like this, don't be afraid of it. It'll be fine. It's going to melt in a minute. Okay, so you'll do both halves of your pumpkin. So making sure again that you get the whole fleshy side. So not just the concave part, but also the part that is flat from where you cut it. So once it's mostly fully coated, you don't want to leave any of that ghee behind because it's delicious. Once it's mostly fully coated, you'll want to make sure that you have a baking sheet. And if you're using an oil like vegetable oil or something like that, you can skip the next step. But if you're using something that's a little bit solid like coconut oil or ghee or something like I'm using, you'll want to first allow it to melt a little bit so you can better coat it. So you'll have a cookie sheet or baking sheet that is lined with parchment paper or foil, whichever one works for you. You're going to put it on there flesh side up, okay? And once your oven is preheated, you'll pop it in the oven and you'll let the solidified oil sort of start to melt give it about 5 minutes. It's not going to take that long. You'll pull the baking sheet back out and again, give it a little bit of a rub. You can also use a basting brush if you don't want to get your fingers involved as well. If you're using an oil like a vegetable oil or an olive oil and it's already liquefied and you've fully coated the whole pumpkin, or after you've sort of swished the ghee or the coconut oil around, you're going to take the pumpkin and you're going to place both halves flesh side down. So you want to make sure that the cookie sheet or baking sheet that you're using is big enough for the pumpkin that you're using. So just know that something like a kabocha squash is quite a bit larger than a pie pumpkin like I'm using. This is the same thing that you would do if you were doing an acorn squash or a butternut squash, anything like that. So once you've got your pumpkin all set up on your baking sheet, make sure your oven is 400 degrees and you'll pop it in the oven. You'll want to bake it for about 45 minutes and you'll know that it's done when you can stick the pins of the fork into the flesh with ease. It should almost be like you can just squish the whole pumpkin without any effort from you. Okay? And then depending on what kind of pumpkin you're using, you'll want to scoop the flesh out when you're done. Okay, If you're using a kabocha squash, some squashes or acorn squash, some squashes you can actually eat the flesh of the pumpkin or squash. So just depending on what you're using. Okay, make sure the squash is fully cooled before you scoop it out so that you don't burn your hands, or make sure that you use a pot holder to hold the squash as you scoop it out. Okay, so thank you so much for joining me, and if this was helpful, you can get more Ayurveda tips and kitchen tips at sageandfellow.com or join me for a cooking class. So I hope to see you next time.